Welcome to the video lecture for Unit 4, Module 9.2. In this one, we're going to discuss electrolyte balance. As always, here are your learning objectives. Be sure to reference these when studying for both your lecture quiz and your unit exam. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So you're in electrolyte balance when gains and losses are equal for each electrolyte in your body. Electrolyte balance is important because total electrolyte concentrations directly affect water balance, as previously described, and the concentrations of individual electrolytes can affect cell functions. We saw many examples in earlier modules, including the effect of abnormal sodium concentrations on neuron activity and the effects of high or low calcium and potassium concentrations on cardiac muscle tissue. Two cations, sodium and potassium, merit particular attention because they, one, are major contributors to the osmotic concentrations of the ECF and the ICF, respectively, and two, they directly affect the normal functioning of all cells. Sodium is the main cation in the ECF. More than 90% of the osmotic concentration of the ECF results from sodium salts, mainly sodium chloride and sodium bicarbonate. Changes in the osmotic concentration of body fluids generally reflect changes in the sodium concentration. Electrolytes in body fluids are measured in terms of equivalents. An equivalent is the amount of a positive or negative ion that supplies 1 mole of electrical charge, and one equivalent is equal to 1,000 milliequivalents. For example, 1 mole of potassium ions and 1 mole of chloride ions are each 1 equivalent, but 1 mole of calcium is 2 equivalents because the calcium ion has a charge of 2. Normal sodium concentrations in the ECF are about 140 milliequivalents per liter versus 10 milliequivalents per liter or less in the ICF. Potassium is the main cation in the ICF, where concentrations reach 160. Extracellular potassium concentrations are generally very low, from 3.5 to 5.5 milliequivalents per liter. Potassium balances are worth noting. 1. The most common problem with electrolyte balances are caused by an imbalance between gains and losses of sodium ions. 2. Problems with potassium balance are less common but significantly more dangerous than problems related to sodium balance. The total amount of sodium in the ECF represents a balance between two factors. One is sodium ion uptake across the digestive epithelium. Sodium ions enter the ECF by crossing the digestive epithelium through diffusion and carrier-mediated transport. The rate of absorption varies directly with the amount of sodium in the diet. 2. Sodium ion excretion by the kidneys and other sites. Sodium ion losses take place primarily by excretion in the urine and through perspiration. The kidneys are the most important sites of sodium regulation. A person in sodium balance typically gains and loses about 48 to 140 milliequivalents of sodium each day. When sodium gains exceed sodium losses, the sodium content in the ECF increases. When losses exceed gains, the sodium content decreases. However, a change in the sodium content of the ECF does not produce a change in the sodium concentration. When sodium intake or output changes, a corresponding gain or loss of water tends to keep the sodium concentration constant. For example, if you eat a very salty meal, the osmotic concentration of the ECF will not increase. When sodium ions are pumped across the digestive epithelium, the solute concentration in that portion of the ECF increases, and that of the intestinal content decreases. Osmosis then occurs. Additional water enters the ECF from the digestive tract, increasing the blood volume and blood pressure. For this reason, people with high blood pressure or a renal salt sensitivity are advised to restrict the amounts of salt in their diet. The sodium regulatory mechanism changes the ECF volume but keeps the sodium concentration fairly stable. If you consume large amounts of salt without adequate fluid, as when you eat salty potato chips without taking a drink, the plasma sodium concentration increases temporarily. A change in the ECF volume soon follows. However, fluid will exit the ICF, increasing ECF volume and decreasing sodium concentration somewhat. The secretion of ADH restricts water loss and stimulates thirst, promoting additional water consumption. Due to the inhibition of water receptors in the pharynx, ADH secretion begins even before sodium absorption occurs. The ADH secretion rate increases more after sodium absorption due to osmoreceptor stimulation. When sodium losses exceed gains, the volume of the ECF decreases. This reduction occurs without a significant change in the osmotic concentration of the ECF. Thus, if you perspire heavily but consume only tap water, you'll lose sodium and the osmotic concentration of the ECF will decrease briefly. However, as soon as the osmotic concentration drops by 2% or more, ADH secretion decreases, so water losses by your kidneys increase. As water leaves the ECF, the osmotic concentration returns to normal. Minor changes in the ECF volume do not matter because they do not cause adverse physiological effects. If, however, regulation of sodium concentrations results in a large change in the ECF volume, the situation will become corrected by the same homeostatic mechanisms responsible for regulating blood volume and blood pressure. This is the case because when ECF volume changes, so does plasma and, in turn, blood volume. If ECF volume increases, blood volume increases, and if ECF volume decreases, blood volume decreases. Blood volume has a direct effect on blood pressure. An increase in blood volume increases blood pressure, and a decrease in blood volume decreases blood pressure. The net result is that homeostatic mechanisms can monitor ECF volume indirectly by monitoring blood pressure. The receptors involved are baroreceptors at the carotid sinus, the aortic sinus, and the right atrium. Sustained abnormalities in the sodium concentration in the ECF occur only when there are several problems with the fluid balance, such as dehydration or overhydration. When the body's water content increases enough to decrease the sodium concentration of the ECF below 135 milliequivalents per liter, a state of hyponatremia, or low salt, exists. When body water content decreases, the sodium concentration increases. When that concentration exceeds 145 milliequivalents per liter, hypernatremia exists. If the ECF volume is inadequate, both blood volume and blood pressure decrease, and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is activated. In response, losses of water and sodium are decreased, and gains of water and sodium are increased. The net result is that the ECF volume increases. Although the total amount of sodium in the ECF is increasing, gains exceed losses. The sodium concentration in the ECF remains unchanged because osmotic water movement accompanies sodium absorption. If the plasma volume becomes abnormally large, venous return increases, stretching the atrial and ventricular walls and stimulating the release of natriuretic peptides ANP and BNP. This in turn decreases thirst and blocks the secretion of ADH and aldosterone, which together promote water or salt conservation. As a result, salt and water lost by the kidneys increases and the volume of the ECF decreases. About 98% of the body's potassium is in the ICF. Cells expend energy to recover potassium ions as they diffuse their plasma membranes and into the ECF. The potassium concentrations outside of the cell is relatively low, and the concentration at the ECF at any moment represents the balance between 1, the rate of gain across the digestive epithelium, and 2, the rate of loss to urine. Potassium loss in urine is regulated by controlling the activities of ion pumps along the distal portion of the nephron and the collecting system. Whenever a sodium ion is reabsorbed from the tubular fluid, it generally is exchanged for cation, or typically potassium, from the peritubular fluid. Urinary potassium losses are usually limited to the amount of gain by absorption across the digestive epithelium, typically 50 to 100 milliequivalents per day. Potassium losses in feces and perspiration are negligible. The potassium concentration in the ECF is controlled by adjustments in the rate of active secretion among the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting system of the nephron. The rate of tubular secretion of potassium into urine varies in response to 3 factors. 1. Changes in the potassium concentration of the ECF. In general, the higher the extracellular concentration of potassium, the higher the rate of secretion. 2. Changes in pH. When the pH of the ECF decreases, so does the pH of the peritubular fluid. The rate of potassium secretion then decreases because hydrogen ions, rather than potassium ions, are secreted in exchange for sodium ions in tubular fluid. 3. Aldosterone levels. The hormone aldosterone strongly affects the rate at which potassium is lost in urine. The ion pumps that are sensitive to this hormone reabsorb sodium from tubular fluid in exchange for potassium from peritubular fluid. Aldosterone secretion is stimulated by angiotensin II as part of the regulation of blood volume. High plasma potassium concentrations also stimulate aldosterone secretion directly. Either way, under the influence of aldosterone, the amount of sodium conserved and the amount of potassium excreted in urine are directly related. 2 disorders of potassium imbalance are hypoalkemia and hyperalkemia. Hypoalkemia is the deficiency of potassium in the bloodstream. Hyperalkemia is an elevated level of potassium in the bloodstream. The ECF concentrations of other electrolytes are regulated as well. Here we'll consider the most important ions involved: calcium, magnesium, phosphate, and chloride. Additional information about those is listed in Table 27-2, along with the information about disorders that occur if we have too much or too little of them in the body. Calcium is the most abundant mineral in the body. A typical person has 1 to 2 kilograms of this element. 99% of it is in the skeleton. In addition to forming the crystalline component of bone, calcium ions play key roles in controlling muscular and neural activities, in blood clotting, as cofactors for enzymatic reactions, and as second messengers. Calcium homeostasis primarily reflects an interplay between the reserves in bone, the rate of absorption across the digestive tract, and the rate of loss by the kidneys. The hormones parathyroid hormone, or PTH, calcitriol, and, to a lesser degree, calcitonin, maintain calcium homeostasis in the ECF. Parathyroid hormone and calcitriol increase calcium concentrations. Their actions are opposed by calcitonin. A small amount of calcium is lost in the bile. Under normal circumstances, very little calcium escapes in urine or feces. To keep pace with these losses, an adult must absorb only about 0.8 to 1.2 grams per day of calcium. That amount represents only about 0.03% of the calcium reserves in the skeleton. PTH from the parathyroid gland and calcitriol from the kidneys stimulate calcium absorption by the digestive tract and calcium reabsorption along the distal convoluted tubule. Hypercalcemia exists when calcium concentration of the ECF exceeds 5.3 milliequivalents per liter. The primary cause of hypercalcemia in adults is hyperparathyroidism, which is a condition resulting from the PTH oversecretion. Less common causes include malignant cancers of the breast, lung, kidney, and bone marrow, and excessive use of calcium or vitamin D supplements. Severe hypercalcemia causes such signs and symptoms such as fatigue, confusion, cardiac arrhythmias, and calcifications of kidneys and soft tissues throughout the body. Hypocalcemia is much less common than hypercalcemia. Hypoparathyroidism, or undersecretion of PTH, vitamin D deficiency, or chronic renal failure is typically responsible for hypocalcemia. Signs and symptoms include muscle spasms, sometimes with generalized convulsions, weak heartbeats, cardiac arrhythmias, and osteoporosis. The adult body contains about 29 grams of magnesium. Almost 60% of it is in the skeleton. The magnesium in body fluids is primarily found in the ICF. There, the concentration of magnesium averages about 26 milliequivalents per liter. Magnesium is required as a cofactor for several important enzymatic reactions, including the phosphorylation of glucose within the cell and the use of ATP by contracting muscle fibers. The typical range of magnesium concentrations in the ECF is about 1.4 to 2.0 milliequivalents per liter, considerably lower than the levels in the ICF. The proximal convoluted tubule reabsorbs magnesium very efficiently. Keeping pace with the daily urinary losses requires a minimum dietary intake of only about 24 to 32 milliequivalents per day. Phosphate ions are required for bone mineralization. About 740 grams are bound up in the mineral salts of the skeleton. In body fluids, the most important functions of phosphate involve the ICF. Inside the cells, the ions are required for the formation of high-energy compounds, the activation of enzymes, and the synthesis of nucleic acid. The phosphate concentration of the plasma is usually 1.8 to 3.0 milliequivalents per liter. Phosphate ions are reabsorbed from the tubular fluid along the proximal convoluted tubule. Calcitriol stimulates phosphine ion reabsorption through the PCT. Urinary and fecal losses of potassium amount to about 30 to 45 milliequivalents per day. Chloride ions are the most abundant anions in the ECF. The normal plasma concentration is 100 to 108 milliequivalents. In the ICF, chloride concentrations are usually low. Chloride ions are absorbed across the digestive tract together with sodium ions. Several carrier proteins along the renal tubules reabsorb calcium with sodium. The amount of calcium loss is small. A gain of 48 to 146 milliequivalents per day will keep pace with the losses in urine and perspiration.